Good morning. Welcome to the 10:30 April 2014 meeting of the Federal Communications Commission. Madam Secretary, would you please introduce the agenda for today?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you and good morning, Commissioners. Today's agenda includes 2 items for your consideration. First, you will consider a report and order, declaratory ruling, order, memorandum opinion and order, and 7th order on reconsideration, taking significant steps to continue the implementation of the landmark reforms adopted in the 2011 USF ICC Transformation Order to modernize universal service for the 21st century. An accompanying further notice of proposed rulemaking proposes measures to update and further implement the framework adopted by the Commission in 2011. Second, you will consider a further notice of proposed rulemaking that would implement an innovative 3-tier spectrum sharing approach to make up to 150 megahertz of spectrum available for wireless broadband use in the 3550 to 3700 megahertz band. The Commission also has before it today a consent agenda consisting of the items listed under Consent Agenda on the Commission's Sunshine Notice released on April 16, 2014. Please note that items 3 and 4 were adopted by the Commission and have been deleted from today's consent agenda. This is your agenda for today. The first item will be presented by the Wireline Competition Bureau. Julie Veach, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Ms. Veach.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. We're pleased to present for your consideration today an item that is the next significant step in our implementation of the landmark Universal Service Intercarrier Compensation Transformation Order. Already, Phase 1 in the Connect America Fund is bringing new broadband to over 1.6 million Americans. Phase 2 will bring broadband to nearly 5 million additional Americans over the next 5-year period. Among other things, today's item will lay the groundwork for implementation of the Phase 2 competitive bidding process expected to occur in 2015. Combined with the Bureau's release yesterday of an order adopting the forward-looking cost model for Phase 2, this item will move the Commission closer to its goal of extending the offer of model-based support to price cap carriers by the end of this year. I'd like to acknowledge the team that has worked tirelessly in recent months to bring this item to fruition, led at the division level by Alex Menard and Suzanne Yellen. I'd also like to thank our colleagues in the Wireless Bureau, the Office of Native Affairs and Policy, and the Office of Strategic Planning for their significant contributions. With me at the table are Suzanne Yellen, Assistant Chief in our Industry Analysis Division, Jim Schlichting, Senior Deputy Chief in the Wireless Bureau, Carol Maddie, Deputy Chief in the Wireline Bureau, and Heidi Lanco, Attorney Advisor in the Telecommunications Access Policy Division. Heidi will now present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. The draft item that we present to you today takes significant steps to continue the implementation of the landmark reforms unanimously adopted by the Commission in 2011 to modernize universal service for the 21st century. A core component of the 2011 reforms was the creation of the Connect America Fund to preserve and advance voice and robust broadband, both fixed and mobile, in high-cost areas of the nation that the marketplace would not otherwise serve. Today's order adopts rules that build on the Connect America Fund framework established in 2011. Yesterday, the Wireline Competition Bureau released an order finalizing decisions related to the Connect America Fund Phase 2 cost model that will be used to make the offer of model-based Phase 2 support. To implement Phase 2, the Commission will also need to adopt rules for the competitive bidding process that will occur in states where the price cap carrier declines to make a state-level commitment. The item before you establishes several key parameters for the Phase 2 competitive bidding process. Specifically, the order concludes that all high-cost areas and price cap areas where the average cost per location equals or exceeds a specified cost benchmark are eligible for Phase 2 support in the competitive bidding process. It permits price cap carriers that decline model-based support to participate in the competitive bidding process, and it established a term of 10 years for support awarded through the competitive bidding process. The order also concludes that parties may seek designation as eligible telecommunication carriers after notification that they are winning bidders for the offer of support. Further, today's item proposes to finalize other matters related to the implementation of Phase 2 of the Connect America Fund, including the design of the competitive bidding process and service obligations for price cap carriers that choose frozen support in lieu of model-based support. In addition to addressing Phase 2 support for price cap carriers, today's order provides a solid foundation for promoting investment in broadband in areas served by rate of return carriers. The order gives rate of return carriers greater clarity regarding their obligation to extend broadband upon a reasonable request by providing guidance regarding what constitutes a reasonable request. Today's order also modifies certain aspects of the 2011 USF ICC Transformation Order in response to petitions from a variety of stakeholders. First, the order provides a more measured transition for rate of return carriers that would have qualified under the prior rules for support based on their significant network investment by permitting such carriers to receive support for investments made in 2010 and 2011. Second, in response to concerns that the current benchmarking rule is not effectively advancing the Commission's objectives, the order eliminates the benchmarking rule. Therefore, rate of return carrier support will no longer be limited by benchmarks calculated using the quantile regression analysis. The order also delays and phases in support reductions associated with a 2014 rate floor over a multi-year period, providing time for incumbent carriers and state commissions to make any adjustments they deem necessary. The further notice before you proposes a Connect America Fund for rate of return carriers. It proposes short-term measures to address identified shortcomings in the existing support mechanisms for rate of return carriers. For longer-term reform, it proposes to create a new mechanism that will support broadband-capable networks within the existing budget and invites specific proposals to accomplish that objective. The item also proposes to adopt a voluntary path to model-based support for rate of return carriers that wish to make such an election. In addition, the further notice proposes adjustments in light of marketplace developments. In 2011, the Commission adopted a universal service framework that included a goal of ensuring that those living in high-cost areas have access to services that are reasonably comparable to services offered in urban areas. The Commission also made a commitment to adapting universal service reforms as necessary to achieve this, including revisiting minimum broadband speed requirements. At the time, it committed to revisiting the broadband performance obligations by 2014. Consistent with those objectives, today's item initiates that proceeding and proposes to revise the current broadband performance obligations for recipient of high-cost support to require minimum downstream speeds of 10 megabits per second. Finally, the further notice proposes to focus Mobility Fund Phase 2 on those areas of the country where 4G LTE is not and will not be available in the foreseeable future, and to modify the timetable for the phase-down in competitive ETC support. The Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. Commissioner Clyburn.
Thank you. For most Americans, going without their cell phone, tablet, or access to the internet for any length of time is difficult. Indeed, most in this room can barely get through a commission meeting without checking and sending email or contributing to social media accounts. Commissioner Pye. What we too often take for granted, however, is that this engagement is one in which millions of Americans do without every single day, denying them the advantages and opportunities access to broadband provides, getting a better education, utilizing advanced remote healthcare monitoring, finding the best job, working from home, maintaining connections with loved ones, and participating in civic engagement. Congress directed the FCC to ensure that all Americans, including low-income Americans, have access to advanced telecommunications and information services. In 2011, this commission, after years of good faith efforts faltered, comprehensively reformed its universal service and inter-carrier compensation regimes and put this country on a path to further close these divides. This was no easy task, for changes to any entitlement program are always difficult. But I am proud to have been a part of a landmark decision that has already paved the way to connect over 1 million Americans with broadband for the first time, provide mobile coverage to tens of thousands of road miles, and connect over 50,000 people living on tribal lands with access to mobile broadband. We also reformed intercarrier compensation in a manner that stopped the unpredictable declines in revenues and provided carriers with certainty and predictability regarding future revenues. At the same time, I have always made clear that we should be open to make course corrections when appropriate. The USF ICC transformation order is nearly 800 pages long and was bound to include policies, however well-intended, that did not quite achieve our objective or take into account a market that developed differently than anticipated. So I support today's item because it continues down the path of reform while making needed adjustments and asking questions to ensure that we use universal service funds as prudently and as efficiently as possible. There is no question that an item this broad in scope would include pieces I would have drafted differently, but overall, it strikes the right balance. I'd like to take a few moments to highlight a few aspects. I strongly supported the creation of the first universal service fund dedicated to mobility to ensure that consumers have access to mobile broadband services by providing ongoing support to providers in rural and high-cost areas. I am pleased that Mobility Fund Phase 1 and the Tribal Mobility Fund Phase 1 are in the process of connecting tens of thousands of previously unserved areas and populations. Today's item proposes to retarget the Mobility Fund Phase 2 in light of marketplace developments. I appreciate the support of Chairman Wheeler and my colleagues to propose to maintain and retain a dedicated mobility fund focused on preserving service that exists today due to support from the Universal Service Fund and extending service to areas unserved by 4G LTE. If the size of the Refocused Mobility Fund 2 is less than the $500 million adopted in the transformation order, the item proposes to use unused funding to extend broadband through the Connect America Phase 2 or Remote Areas Fund. This proposal furthers our goal of ensuring all Americans have access to advanced services such as 4G LTE while continuing to extend broadband through the Connect America Fund. At the same time, I was concerned about continuing to phase down competitive ETC support before the Commission finalizes a retargeted Mobility Fund 2. Without sufficient data on how small and regional carriers are using competitive ETC support today, continuing the phase down could put consumers at risk of losing mobile service, which is in tension with the directive in the statute for the Commission to set policies based on the, and I quote, preservation and advancement of universal service. For these reasons, I advocated including the pause in the transformation order, and I'm once again grateful for the support of my colleagues to propose to retain the pause so that small and regional providers will have certainty about the opportunities of a retargeted Mobility Fund 2 before the phase down continues. There has been significant focus recently on the Commission's rate floor. Concerns have been raised about affordability in rural areas, and I share them. But my concerns rest not only with rural areas. We should also be asking why rates increase so unexpectedly in urban areas where significant levels of poverty exist and the cost of living tends to be higher. Had the urban average stayed fairly constant, the rate floor would not have increased much above the current $14, and we would not even be having this debate. Coincidentally or not, urban rate increases occurred around the times state deregulated their local end user rates. And I note the highest monthly rates rest with the non-incumbent VoIPs, which typically are not regulated. So yes, Concerns about the affordability of rates in rural and urban areas are valid, but the mechanism to address these concerns, I believe, rests with our Lifeline program, not the program which subsidizes the cost of networks in high-cost areas without any regard to the wealth demographics of a given area. The item also reconsiders several rules from the transformation order regarding reforms to the rate of return carriers, including the safety net additive for carriers that qualify due to investment and the benchmark rule, also known as quantile regression. While I agree that the benchmark rule did not necessarily achieve its intended goal of rewarding carriers that invested efficiently with additional support, I do have concerns about returning to the OHCLS race to the top rule, where carriers with the highest costs get support and carriers with lower costs receive little or no support. I want to thank Commissioner O'Reilly for working with my office on this issue and appreciate the chairman for addressing these concerns with specific proposals to reform HCLS in the near term while seeking comment on a long-term solution for rate of return carriers consistent with the goals of the transformation order of expanding broadband while encouraging and rewarding increased efficiency. Rate of return carriers often operate in the hardest to serve rural areas, such as Moncks Corner, South Carolina, where I spent many summers and weekends. I didn't appreciate it then, but I do now. And areas that need and benefit from broadband connectivity. I look forward to working with my colleagues in moving quickly to adopt near-term and long-term reforms. The item makes significant progress adopting and proposing rules for the Connect America Fund competitive bidding process. I support the decision to enable providers to receive ETC designation after being selected in the competitive bidding process. This retains the critical state role in the ETC process while encouraging the broad participation in the competitive process. The Commission also seeks comments on aspects of the right of first refusal process, including whether the speed should evolve, and also proposes public interest in broadband deployment obligations for insular areas that elect to continue to receive frozen support. Finally, I applaud the Wireline Competition Bureau's tireless work that culminated in the adoption of the cost model yesterday, a significant achievement in and of itself. As I said when the Commission adopted the transformation order, this is a marathon, not a sprint. And while the progress we're making today will put us ever so close to the finish line, we've got more work to do. So again, I thank the dedicated staff of the Wireline Competition Bureau, the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, Rebecca Goodhart in my office, as well as the many other offices and bureaus that work so hard on this significant item. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you to the Commissioner from Moncks Corners. Commissioner Rosenworth.
Thank you. I want to start by just acknowledging the title of what we're voting on, which is Report and Order, Declaratory Ruling, Order, Memorandum Opinion and Order, and Seventh Order on Reconsideration, all of which is proof positive that the people at the table have been very busy. Now, universal service is a cherished principle in communications. After all, it was back in 1934 when Congress first directed the Commission to make communication by wire and radio available so far as possible to all the people of the United States. And it was Congress who expanded on this notion by adding new principles to guide universal service policy in 1996. As a result, the duty to preserve and advance universal service is now the law of the land. Technology changes, but this basic legal principle does not. So I appreciate the work of my predecessors here at the Commission, who more than 2 years ago sought to update our universal service policies from top to bottom. They refocused the fund from last century's technology on the broadband and wireless challenges of today. They put it on a budget, and they increased accountability throughout. This was not easy, and I applaud their efforts. But as I have said before, I am concerned that when you add the piece parts of our reform together, and they are manifold, what we have is extremely complex. I fear that this complexity can deny carriers dependent on the system the certainty they need to confidently invest in their network infrastructure. So when opportunities arise to simplify our rules in a manner that is fiscally sound, good for rural consumers, and bound to inspire investment, we should seize them. And in many ways, we do that today. Over the last year, many rural carriers have argued that the uncertainty created by our regression model has hindered their ability to invest in their networks. Today, we answer their pleas because we have determined that they were right. So we eliminate it, and this is good. In addition, we have made adjustments to allow those who relied on receiving safety net additive support under our prior rules, and also made significant network investments in 2010 and 2011 to receive that support. This is also good. At the same time, we adopt an extensive further notice of proposed rulemaking that delves into the details of how we will implement the Connect America Fund, the Mobility Fund, and the transition of rural carriers to a broadband support mechanism. Back in 1996, Congress directed us to ensure that universal service evolves over time. In many ways, that is what our rulemaking does today. But I'm sensitive that as we seek to evolve universal service policy, we can create more complexity and uncertainty for broadband and wireless providers. Building networks takes time, and it is not easy in our least populated communities. So as we move forward, I hope we can craft rules in a way that ultimately reduces complexity and uncertainty. Because if we do this right, we will connect America by providing better broadband and wireless service in rural America. So thank you to the Wireline Competition Bureau and the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau. I know it's been a long, hard slog, and it is not over yet. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Rosenworcel. Commissioner Pai.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the Universal Service Transformation Order, the Commission performed the Herculean, or Heraclean if you're a stickler for the Greek, task of reorienting the Universal Service Fund away from supporting telephone service and towards supporting broadband service. But no commissioner is the child of Zeus, so it is unsurprising that the Commission made some mistakes and left some labors unfinished. So here we are, reconsidering the transformation order for the 7th time. I thank the staff of the various bureaus for their extraordinary work on this over the years, and I welcome the continued collaboration with my colleagues. I appreciate as well some of the progress that we were able to make today. But I also fear that some of today's decisions set us up for reconsiderations 8, 9, and beyond. In particular, I strongly disagree with the Commission's decision to substantially increase many Americans' rural phone bills, and so I accordingly approve in part and dissent in part. To start with the positive, today's order strikes from the books the quantile regression analysis benchmarks. As Chairman Wheeler likes to say, this is a big deal. I applaud him for tackling this challenge, even though the benchmarks had been unanimously adopted in the transformation order a few years ago. This has been a long and hard struggle. When I first questioned whether the QRA benchmarks were good policy in 2012, many people told me that eliminating them was a hopeless cause and that incremental change was all that could be accomplished. But as the QRA benchmarks' impact became more apparent, the tide turned. A unanimous vote for adopting the benchmarks then has turned today into a unanimous vote to repeal them. As we recognize in this item, whatever the intended purpose of the QRA benchmarks, in practice, they chilled the investment climate and impeded the deployment of broadband to rural Americans. Even the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Rural Utilities Service told us that carriers had stopped taking out loans to deploy broadband because of them. The benchmarks introduced substantial uncertainty into the marketplace. Carriers had no idea what support they would be receiving from one year to the next. And that's a big problem, because investing in rural America is not a 1 or 2 year decision. It's a 10 or 20-year commitment. Accordingly, our policies must reflect the unique challenges that rural carriers face when building their networks. Just as important, the QRA benchmarks were not designed to save the fund a dollar. So keeping them on our books just meant further hardships for rural America with no federal benefit. I'm also pleased that my colleagues agreed with my suggestion to propose a standalone broadband funding mechanism for rate of return carriers serving the highest cost reaches of our country. Through a quirk of regulatory history, our rules offer universal service support to such carriers to build out broadband, but only when they bundle their broadband services with traditional telephone lines. Now, that system increasingly has come under strain as consumers flee landlines in favor of wireless and over-the-top alternatives. Indeed, it has put some carriers to a Hobson's choice. On one hand, they can offer standalone broadband, which urban consumers have and rural consumers want, and lose universal service support. Or, on the other, they can deny consumers that option, only to have them drop service altogether. The net result is that the rural carriers must hold back investment because they're unsure if they can deploy the services that consumers are demanding. A standalone broadband mechanism could change all that. It would correct this vestige of our outdated rules. It would give consumers the real option of choosing whether they want to purchase broadband and telephone service from the same company. Removing this barrier will give carriers more assurance that legacy regulations won't prevent them from responding to consumer demand. This will increase broadband deployment, and all of this will be done within the existing budget, something everyone with a phone line should celebrate. For these reasons, I hope that we move quickly forward to adopt final rules implementing a standalone broadband mechanism. Now, unfortunately, I cannot support every aspect of today's item. One particular problem, as I hinted earlier, is the Commission's reaffirmation of the rate floor, an unfortunate legacy of the transformation order. Now, under that policy, the FCC sets a minimum price that telephone companies can charge their customers for local telephone service, and it penalizes those companies that do not comply with this government mandate. As a result of that policy, over 1 million rural Americans can expect their local telephone rates to increase by up to 46% as the rate floor rises from $14 per month to $20.46 per month. By design, the rate floor targets our farmers, our ranchers, our small-town entrepreneurs, and other rural Americans with a significant rate hike. As public knowledge has said, it will harm access to service for some of the most vulnerable consumers in rural America. As AARP and others have said, it will impose a disproportionate burden on older Americans who are much more likely to be living on fixed incomes. In other words, the rate floor targets those very Americans who are still waiting for the economic recovery to arrive. But it won't affect Washington, D.C. Even though the local phone rate in the District of Columbia is $14.10, it's not subject to the rate floor. As a consequence, the FCC will be directing rural Americans to pay 45% more for local phone service than those living in the nation's capital do. That may not be a problem for residents of Northwest Washington, but I seem to doubt that residents of Northwest Montana would see it as fair. Another result of the rate floor will be less broadband deployment. As I mentioned earlier, line loss is an all-too real problem in rural America. About 1 in 7 households with copper dropped their landline altogether in 2012. And government-mandated price increases are only likely to send more consumers off the network. That makes it even harder for rural companies to plan for the future and invest in their networks. That creates yet another disincentive to offer standalone broadband because those same companies may have to compete with over-the-top providers not subject to the same government-mandated price increases. In short, that moves us in the wrong direction. So what justifies mandating higher prices in rural America? In my view, it's not the Communications Act. That act requires that telephone rates in rural areas be reasonably comparable to rates in urban areas and affordable to all consumers. And until the Universal Service Transformation Order, those principles had consistently been interpreted to mean that our universal service policies should aim to reduce, not to increase, the amount that rural consumers pay for telephone service. This is hardly surprising, given that rates increasing can hardly be making them more affordable. Moreover, the rate floor assumes that what is affordable in our country's largest cities is the same as what is affordable in the countryside. That's not the case. Jobs simply pay more in the big cities, and families living there often have much more disposable income. I have a few slides available to illustrate this point. It doesn't get more high-tech than this. And to illustrate, compare Washington, D.C., where the monthly rate will remain $14.10, to Ouachita County, Arkansas, where we have mandated an increase up to $20.46. Now, in Washington, D.C., the median household income is $64,627. In Ouachita County, it's not even half that, $32,032. So what does this mean in practice for consumers in each place? 1 year of phone service in D.C. will cost $169.20, or about 0.26% of the median family's household income. But 1 year of phone service in Ouachita County will cost a median family in that area $245, so that the family will need to spend about 3 times as much of their annual income as the family in Washington, D.C. I simply cannot fathom how mandating a result like this serves the public interest. Nor, as some have claimed, does the rate floor reduce excessive subsidies for basic phone service. Now recall that the rate floor was expressly designed to increase rural rates without reducing the subsidies that carriers receive. This is an important point. So long as carriers raise their rates up to the rate floor, they receive the same subsidy. So even with rural consumers paying more, there's not a single dollar in savings to the fund that could be used to decrease everyone's rates or to deploy more broadband. So if not law, what policy justifies an increase in the rate floor? How should we respond to consumers like Tressa White of Ouachita County, Arkansas? She, as you can see on our FCC website, wrote to the FCC just yesterday to complain that her local telephone company is raising rates to meet the rate floor. She asked, "What will I be receiving because of this increase in my monthly rate?" In a word, Tressa, nothing. As the AARP put it, the rate floor is, and I quote, "a punitive burden on those households that continue to purchase wireline telephone service, with the higher rates benefiting only the local telephone company." Or, as the National Tribal Telecommunications Association wrote, "Asking consumers to pay more for nothing in return is counterproductive to universal voice and broadband service goals." As far as I can tell, and these entities as well, the purpose of the rate floor is to increase rural telephone rates for its own sake. Now, I'm not alone in thinking that this policy does not make sense. Over the past few weeks, we've seen an outpouring of concern from all quarters about the continued implementation of the rate floor. Telephone companies like Pioneer in Kansas, Copper Valley in Alaska, and Frontier in West Virginia oppose the rate floor and the burden that it will place on their hardworking consumers. The independent carrier associations in Colorado, Idaho, Nevada, Oregon, and Washington have called for a moratorium and a re-examination of the public policy issues surrounding the urban rate floor concept. A group of rural telecom associations has called on the FCC to revisit the fundamental operation of the rate floor. Public Knowledge, the National Consumer Law Center, the Center for Media Justice, Common Cause, the Center for Rural Strategies, and the Rural Broadband Policy Group have asked us to hit the pause button, step back, and examine whether the proposed rate floor changes and implementation plan serve the underlying reasons for creating a rate floor in the first place. Nor is this a partisan issue. Senator Mark Pryor of Arkansas has urged us to reconsider the rate floor, as has his Arkansas colleague, Senator John Boozman. And incidentally, as many of you may know, Senator Boozman had emergency surgery yesterday, and I wish him well in his recovery. Similarly, Alaska Senators Mark Begich and Lisa Murkowski and Congressman Don Young jointly have asked the FCC to freeze the rate floor and re-examine the underlying policy. And Senator Jerry Moran of my home state of Kansas has reminded us that the rate floor only makes phone service less affordable in rural areas, where incomes are lower and families have fewer telecommunications options. What it comes down to is this. Rural Americans aren't asking for free phones or free service. They're just asking the government not to mandate a 46% increase in their monthly phone bill. And when so many voices make such a reasonable request, it's very disappointing that the Commission's answer today is no. If we are trying to keep rural America in mind in everything that we do, our response should be different. Now, to be sure, the Commission does decide today that the rate floor will go into effect later than originally proposed. And that delay is a good thing. By pushing back the first phase of the increase to January 1st of 2015, the Commission has opened up a 6-month window for us to re-examine this policy before it fully hits rural America. Now, that's especially important because the Commission only released the rate floor data and methodology last Friday, only 5 days ago. With 6 more months, we can respond to the request of our state counterparts, those with direct and actual authority over local telephone rates, to let the public study and comment on the data and methodology before the rate floor takes effect. That would be consistent with our past practice. And it also would give time to the Universal Service Administrative Company to collect data on the actual number of consumers that will be hit by the rate floor. So, as the tide turned with the QRA benchmarks, I still hold out hope that it can be turned here. And just as tinkering around the edges wasn't good enough to save the QRA benchmarks, I don't believe that phasing in a big price hike for rural Americans will make this issue go away. I, for one, intend to keep making my voice heard. Now, our decision with respect to the rate floor is all the more disappointing because today the Commission missed a chance to substantially reduce excessive subsidies in a way that actually would have saved consumers money. Specifically, this item recognizes that wireless providers are deploying more mobile broadband far more quickly and far more extensively than the Commission anticipated in the transformation order. Accordingly, the Commission does not need all the funding it has collected for the Mobility Fund Phase 2 in order to extend mobile broadband service to otherwise unserved areas, including tribal lands. I therefore proposed that we return up to $400 million a year to American consumers over the next 5 years. Rather than take this approach, however, the order proposes to keep the majority of the Mobility Fund Phase 2 intact, not because it's needed for deployment or even for maintaining service, but instead because that's how much regional wireless providers are getting, even though they are using that money to compete with private investment and duplicate each other's service areas. In sum, my proposals taken together would have cut unnecessary subsidies, protected rural Americans from substantial price increases, and lowered all consumers' phone bills in rural and urban areas alike. Unfortunately, today's item does the opposite. And as a result, I must respectfully dissent in part from today's item. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are many different views on how to meet our statutory obligation to preserve and advance universal service so that all consumers have access to reasonably comparable services at reasonably comparable rates. The fact that rational minds may differ is not surprising given the complexities of universal service policies and their importance to our nation. The 2011 USF ICC Transformation Order recognized these complexities and created a multi-part framework for tackling them. I don't agree with every reform, but I commend those that were here for their courage to start us down those paths. The question before us now is whether to continue down these paths or disruptively reverse course. And we must remain mindful that we are dealing with scarce consumer-provided dollars. Every dollar we can save by targeting funding to areas where there is no other provider and by making the programs more efficient is a dollar that we can use to extend service to unserved areas or that we can return to consumers. Therefore, I'm pleased that the further notice recognizes the strides that have been made by wireless and satellite providers and asks how should we modify our policies and funding accordingly. I'm also glad that the order eliminates the QRA benchmarks and that the further notice seeks comment on replacement rules for rate of return carriers. As we consider additional changes to the 2011 framework, however, we must weigh the benefits of continuing to fine-tune our policies against the costs of upending plans and further delaying the remaining reforms. Many consumers throughout rural America are still waiting to see the benefits promised in 2011. Moreover, all of the universal service and inter-carrier compensation reforms are intertwined. If we second-guess too many of the individual reforms, I worry that we put at risk the entire package of reforms that took years to enact. With no one notable exception, I think that today's item hits enough of the right chords for me to lend my support. The one exception is that the further notice proposes to increase the broadband speed standard for all support recipients from the current 4 megabits downstream to 10 megabits downstream before we've completed the task of ensuring that all consumers have access to 4 megabits. I too want to get the most bang for our limited USF bucks, and I want greater speeds for all Americans, especially rural citizens. However, raising the speed standard within our budget could entail significant trade-offs for consumers. In 2011, the Commission decided to cover more consumers with a basic level of broadband service rather than upgrade fewer consumers with a higher capacity service. The decision appears consistent with the statute, which calls for universal service. Moreover, the 4 megabit standard that the Commission selected seems to be reasonably comparable to what is offered in urban areas. For those that have dial-up service or no service at all, getting access to broadband can be a welcome improvement. However, the Commission seems ready to explore undoing the fundamental decision, and more parts of rural America could remain unserved for a lot longer as a result. For example, in price cap areas, raising the standard could shift funding towards upgrading existing broadband service, potentially in areas where there's another provider, rather than extending new broadband service in truly unserved areas. In addition, it could mean that some price cap carriers that would have quickly expanded broadband throughout their entire territories decide not to make a statewide commitment to provide service, or that they scale back the percentage of locations that they're willing to serve. I would have retained the current speed standard for now and avoided these trade-offs altogether. Raising the speed standard is a questionable approach and potentially sends the wrong signals to providers, the markets, and most importantly, consumers. As a result, I must concur with this section of the further notice. While not addressed in this item, I note that the CAF reserve is projected to exceed $1.5 billion and is now growing at a rate of over $190 million per quarter. That extra money has been coming out of the pockets of consumers, who are now paying 16.6% fees on their phone bills. I do not see the upside of maintaining such large reserves while we continue to revise the programs, and I do see some real downsides. Once we've decided how to revise the programs to ensure that money is well spent, I'm hopeful that we'll be in a position to review the budget, which is currently at $4.5 billion a year, and consider reducing it. In the meantime, we should at least stop overcharging consumers. Perhaps this is something we could consider in the next CAF item. On the whole, I support today's item. I appreciate the Chairman was willing to accommodate many of my suggestions, and I thank the good staff for their hard work and assistance. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Reilly. I'll be brief. In the report and order part of this decision, we make a series of important decisions. One of them is to mitigate the impact of the congressionally mandated requirement of reasonable comparability between rates paid by subscribers to USF subsidized carriers and the rates paid by subscribers of non-subsidized carriers. This isn't a rural versus urban issue. This is a matter of how subsidies work, and Congress told us that those subsidies should not produce disparate results in consumers' wallets. So it falls to us to implement that instruction. The first step in any such implementation is to look at broad averages and not anecdotes. Yes, some non-subsidized areas have lower average rates than others. But that's as irrelevant as the fact that some subsidized subscribers in 16 states pay $5 a month or less, and that service is being subsidized by other subscribers in states like Arkansas, Wyoming, Idaho, and Kansas. So looking at the averages, we see a large differential that the statute commands has to be dealt with. And at the same point in time, we recognize that command can take a bite out of individuals' wallets, and how do we mitigate that impact? Thus, what we are proposing today is to follow the statute, but as humanely as possible, phase in the adjustment. In the further notice portion of the item, which, as Commissioner Rosenworcel pointed out, has multiple components, we're asking for input on a series of questions, a couple of which are the issue of broadband speeds. We know that broadband speeds are inexorably increasing, and we celebrate that. But the last thing that we want is for USF to result in some kind of second-class status for broadband in rural areas. And that's why we ask for input on whether our broadband speed target for USF-supported areas should increase from 4 megabits per second to 10 megabits per second. And similarly, we ask questions about the increasing role of wireless technology. And as my colleagues have indicated, we ask many other questions in that further notice. But overall, we are making progress. Thanks to CAF, to the Connect America Fund, we've taken a serious bite out of the lack of broadband access in America and put ourselves on a path to remedying that. And as Commissioner Clyburn pointed out, like any good policy, it proceeds on a step-by-step, logical, incremental basis, which we do here today by taking steps and proposing steps. So along with the rest of my colleagues, thank you to all of the members of both the wireline and the wireless bureaus for your leadership on this. These are non-trivial issues, and we appreciate all of the hard work that you have put into this. So with that, I will call for a vote. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. The request for editorial privileges is granted. And Madam Secretary, will you lead us to our next action item?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the second item on your agenda will be presented by the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau and the Office of Engineering and Technology. It is entitled Amendment of the Commission's Rules with Regard to Commercial Operations in the 3550 to 3650 megahertz band.
Thank you very much. Roger, you want to take over and drive?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. It's my pleasure to introduce this further notice of proposed rulemaking establishing a new service in the 3.5 gigahertz band. I'd like to thank the staff of the Wireless Bureau, OET, the International Bureau, and OGC for their expert contributions to this item. This was truly a collaborative effort. I also want to recognize and thank John Leibovitz, Deputy Chief of the Wireless Bureau and the Chairman's Spectrum Advisor, for his leadership on this item. It is because of John's passion, persistence, and vision that we are presenting today a set of concrete proposals and rules for new wireless service and spectrum sharing paradigm. John will introduce the item.
Today's further notice of proposed rulemaking would propose specific rules for an innovative spectrum sharing framework to make up to 150 megahertz of spectrum available for a variety of uses and applications in the 3.5 gigahertz band. This FNPRM builds on a number of actions the Commission has already taken in this proceeding and represents a significant step forward in the Commission's efforts to make more spectrum available to meet the growing demand for wireless broadband. I'm joined at the table by Julie Knapp, Chief of OET, Bob Nelson, Deputy Chief of IB, Navid Golsahi, an engineer in the Policy and Rules Division of OET, Cameron Etamat, an engineer. Oh, there he is. An engineer in the Mobility Division of WTB, and Paul Powell, an attorney in the Mobility Division of WTB. In addition to the team at the table, I want to echo Roger's thanks to staff in WTB, OET, IB, and OGC, alphabet soup, for their hard work and sharp thinking in the development of this FNPRM. And I want to especially thank our trio of engineers, Navid, Cameron, and also Bob Pavlak, who's not at the table, who were instrumental in developing our technical proposals, and the indispensable Brian Regan, who has kept everything on track throughout the process. Finally, I want to especially thank Paul Powell, the lead attorney on the project. As one nameless division chief put it to me, and let me be clear, this was a compliment, Paul is a one-person wrecking crew. He's been instrumental in getting us to this point, and Paul will present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. This draft further notice of proposed rulemaking proposes to create a new citizens broadband radio service for shared wireless broadband use of the 3550 to 3650 megahertz or 3.5 gigahertz band. The draft also includes a supplemental proposal to extend the rules to cover the 3650 to 3700 megahertz band. The creation of the Citizens Broadband Radio Service was originally proposed in a notice of proposed rulemaking released in December of 2012. Since then, the record has been supplemented by a commission-level public notice on licensing issues and 2 workshops to discuss the technical issues related to the proposed service. This draft builds on the Commission's prior actions and incorporates many of the concepts raised in the extensive record generated in this proceeding. The proposed rules would implement a 3-tiered authorization framework based on recommendations from a report by the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology to authorize a variety of small cell and other broadband uses of the 3.5 gigahertz band on a shared basis with incumbent federal and non-federal users of the band. Access and operations would be managed by a dynamic spectrum access system conceptually similar to the databases used to manage television white spaces devices. As illustrated in this slide, the 3 proposed tiers are incumbent access, priority access, and general authorized access. Incumbent access users would include authorized federal and grandfathered fixed satellite service users currently operating in the 3.5 gigahertz band. These users would be protected from harmful interference from priority access and general authorized access users, and federal incumbents would be protected by geographic exclusion zones incorporated into the spectrum access system. Consistent with the concepts set forth in the public notice, the draft proposes to issue priority access licenses, or PALs, for the priority access tier. Each PAL would be defined as an authorization to use for 1 year a 10 megahertz channel in a single census tract. Licensees would be able to aggregate PALs across time, frequency, and geography. The general authorized access tier would be licensed by rule to permit open, flexible access to the band for the widest possible group of potential users. The draft includes a proposal to reserve at all times a minimum of 50% of the band for general authorized access use. General authorized access users would be permitted to operate opportunistically on unused priority access channels. The draft also proposes a single, highly flexible band plan for the 3.5 gigahertz band, baseline technical standards for devices operating in the band covering a wide variety of potential use cases, and supplemental rules to incorporate the 3650 to 3700 megahertz band into the proposed Citizens Broadband Radio service. The draft also seeks comment on a number of other issues, including the scope of the proposed exclusion zones, interference mitigation strategies for out-of-band operators, and approaches to competitive bidding for PALs. The staff recommends that the Commission adopt this further notice of proposed rulemaking and requests editorial privileges. Thank you.
Well, Commissioner Clyburn.
Mr. Chairman, there are some who say, like oil and water, regulation and innovation just don't mix. All too often, they contend, regulation effectively protects incumbents and stifles innovation by creating barriers to entry for new entrants and disruptive technologies. This proceeding, which builds upon recommendations in the July 2012 PCAST report, offers a possible rebuttal to that position. It clearly shows the federal government understands that technological advances can enable us to depart from traditional regulatory models and adopt new approaches with lower administrative costs, which could spur even greater innovation from incumbent carriers and new entrants. Because repurposing federal spectrum for commercial use can take years, and the country's demand for mobile broadband services will not wait that long, the PCAST report recommends that commercial services share underutilized federal spectrum to the maximum extent possible. The advances in small cell networks and the concepts in the successful TV white space databases make that degree of spectrum sharing possible. So in 2012, the Commission adopted a notice of proposed rulemaking that proposed new spectrum management concepts with a license by rule framework, which would provide for incumbent access, priority access, and general authorized access tiers. We proposed a highly flexible band plan to facilitate rapid broadband deployment while protecting existing federal and commercial incumbent users in the 3.5 gigahertz band. That NPRM also improved on the PCAST recommendation by including the 3650 to 3700 megahertz band. This band is used extensively by wireless internet service providers, or WISP, to provide broadband in rural and in other underserved areas. This further notice brings even more creativity to the proceeding by revising the license framework in order to incentivize more efficient use of the priority access tier. Instead of licensing that tier to only certain institutions by rule, we propose to expand the eligibility to all entities and establish granular, flexible priority access licenses that will amount to a 10 megahertz license for one census tract for 1 year that can be aggregated. If more than one entity wants the same license for the same year, there will be an auction. Although these licenses will have some of the key features of the traditional FCC licenses, such as exclusive spectrum rights, because they are shorter in duration, they would not have other features such as performance requirements. The goal here is to establish a license with lower administrative costs that will allow for micro-targeted network deployments and easy aggregation to serve a larger footprint for a longer period of time. By enabling aggregation, this framework would allow for the type of predictability that would attract larger carriers to invest in equipment for the band. Because we also propose to require interoperability across all three tiers throughout the 150 megahertz in this band, this approach has the added benefit of bringing greater spectrum availability and equipment scale economies to WISP, new entrants, and small businesses who want to provide service in the band. I wish to thank Roger Sherman, Julie Knapp, and the staffs of the Wireless Bureau, the International Bureau, and OET, the Wrecking Crew, and my legal advisor, Louis Peretz, for their hard work on this item and their contributions throughout this proceeding. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Clyburn. Commissioner Roseworcel.
If you want to get a glimpse into the future of spectrum policy, take a look at the 3.5 gigahertz band. What we are poised to do with this band is creative, innovative, and could serve as the blueprint for making smarter use of our airwaves going forward. But before looking ahead, it is helpful to look back at how we got here. 4 years ago, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration identified the 3.5 gigahertz band as one of the spectrum bands most suitable for shared use between government and commercial interests. But the response to the NTIA proposal was muted, interest was limited, and enthusiasm was pretty hard to find. Because it was apparent to everyone that protecting existing users in the band, from Defense Department radars to commercial fixed satellite services, would mean significant geographic limitations for new services. As a result, the ability to make use of this spectrum was limited in the most populous areas of this country. Moreover, because the band is above 3 gigahertz, it did not hold much appeal for mobile broadband. After all, signals at this high frequency can fade too quickly. So, the outlook for commercial opportunity in the 3.5 gigahertz band was not good. But now, based on recommendations from the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, rather than discarding this band as junk, we are staring at new opportunities. These opportunities will be built on a creative three-tiered approach to spectrum access. This proposal simultaneously protects existing users, creates new spectrum licenses custom-built for small cell deployments, and opens up more spectrum for unlicensed services, the jet fuel of wireless innovation. This is very cool and very smart, too. But setting aside history and the here and now, I want to talk about what our proposals mean for the future. First, with our work on the 3.5 gigahertz band, we demonstrate that we are leaving behind the tired notion that we face a choice between licensed and unlicensed airwaves. This kind of division is a simplistic relic from the spectrum past. We cannot let it haunt us in the future. Because there's no doubt that good spectrum policy requires both licensed and unlicensed services. Moreover, the next generation of wireless devices and the coming Internet of Things will not rely on a single spectrum band to function. Instead, services will overcome spectral and physical challenges by moving from frequency to frequency, sometimes on spectrum that is licensed and sometimes on spectrum that is unlicensed. Second, with our work on the 3.5 gigahertz band, we make clear that small cells have a big future. They can expand connectivity and facilitate more efficient use of existing frequencies. They can cover areas that cannot be reached using macro cell services, and at the same time, they can limit interference risk. In fact, through small cell use, what was once considered a weakness of higher spectrum bands, namely shorter propagation distance, can be turned into a strength. Third and finally, if we can manage the exclusion zones that have previously limited interest in the 3.5 gigahertz band, we may have also discovered the key to unlocking use of another 120 megahertz in the 5 gigahertz band. That's because the same kinds of federal radar systems that use the 3.5 gigahertz band also operate in the 5350 to 5470 megahertz band. And for the spectrum geeks in the room, if that sounds familiar, it's because that was a band identified by Congress in the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act as a potential new home for unlicensed services. But our efforts to realize this potential have been frustrated by the usual and the familiar, the needs of existing users in this band, including federal radar systems. However, as we move closer to solutions in the 3.5 gigahertz band, we just might have the blueprint for freeing more spectrum for unlicensed services in the 5350 to 5470 megahertz band. In other words, what we learn from managing exclusion zones in the 3.5 gigahertz band could yield more possibilities for commercial services in the 5 gigahertz band. That would be a good way to honor our directive from Congress, a good way to reduce congestion on licensed service networks, and a good way to increase unlicensed spectrum opportunities. These are all good things that can lead to more spectral support for the Internet of Things. So thank you to the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau and Office of Engineering and Technology, both for your creative work on the 3.5 gigahertz band and for your continuing work on more innovative possibilities for spectrum in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Rosenworcel. Mr. Pai.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Most of us are familiar with the saying, use it or lose it. The 3.5 gigahertz band is a good illustration of the latter option. Relatively minor use of that band by federal incumbents along the nation's coasts has left much of the spectrum simply underutilized for decades. Now it's time to put it to work for consumers. As I observed when we launched this proceeding, a simple test must guide our approach. What works? Can our proposals for the 3.5 gigahertz band be implemented in the real world? Can consumer products be brought to market in a timely manner? We have to approach the 3.5 gigahertz band from a practical perspective, not merely a theoretical one. When viewed through this lens, today's item is a mixed bag, and I therefore will be voting to concur. I'm pleased that our proposals have improved in some respects over the course of the last 16 months. For example, while the 2012 NPRM proposed that the Commission set aside the entire category of Tier 2 priority access authorizations for a small and defined set of preferred users, today's item moves in a different direction. It liberalizes access to the band and proposes that any entity should be eligible to hold a priority access authorization. The item finds that open eligibility will promote more intensive use of the band and promote investment in new small cell technologies, and that could make the 3.5 gigahertz band a success. That's the right approach. Unfortunately, much of this item is deja vu all over again, as Yogi Berra once put it. The foremost problem, in my view, involves exclusion zones. Back in 2010, when the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, or NTIA, first identified the 3.5 gigahertz band for possible commercial use, the agency drew enormously large protection zones around federal incumbent users. And it developed these zones based on an assumption of a specific type of commercial use, one that involved high power, high site macro cell deployments. Now, in light of NTIA's determination, our 2012 NPRM declined to pursue a macro cell approach for the 3.5 gigahertz band. Instead, we sought comment on low power, small cell deployments. Because this kind of network architecture is vastly different from the traditional architecture, we noted that some key NTIA assumptions would not apply and would need to be revisited. We indicated our view that those 2010 exclusion zones could be reduced significantly in light of our small cell proposal. And we asked commenters to perform and to provide the technical analyses that would be necessary to do so. They did. The private sector took up the Commission's call and supplied us with detailed and unchallenged technical analyses showing that NTIA's 2010 exclusion zones can be dramatically reduced for small cell deployments. The calculations performed by Qualcomm have been especially helpful in this regard. They show that NTIA's exclusion zones, which reach a maximum of 346 miles, can be safely reduced to less than 10 miles for small cell deployments. But unfortunately, today's item does not incorporate the unrebutted technical evidence showing that these exclusion zones can be dramatically reduced while still protecting incumbent federal users, evidence that we asked the parties to submit. In fact, the Commission refuses even to seek comment on that analysis and simply proposes to codify the 2010 exclusion zones. To be clear, the Commission does not simply seek comment on this issue. It proposes to adopt those zones as rules. This is surprising for two basic reasons. First, I have yet to hear from anyone who believes that the 2010 exclusion zones are appropriate for the type of small cell uses we're proposing for this band. Indeed, even NTIA did not propose that the Commission adopt those zones for small cell use cases. Its fast-track report included the express caveat that NTIA would need to revise the analysis for any use case other than the high-power one it studied. Similarly, the 2012 PCAST report explained that those zones would be necessary for high-power, wide-area uses, but concluded that low-power uses greatly minimized the need for exclusion zones and could even eliminate them entirely. Second, I have serious concerns about what the item's proposed exclusion zones mean for the success of the 3.5 gigahertz band. Now, I noted at the outset of this proceeding that a decision to adopt these zones would mean that 60% of the U.S. population would be prohibited from using 3.5 gigahertz devices. I explained that this was particularly troublesome because the majority of spectrum-limited markets in the United States fall within those zones. And now the record indicates that the band simply would not be commercially viable were the 3.5 gigahertz band only available for consumer use outside of the 2010 zones. So, to summarize, the entity that drew the 2010 exclusion zones did not recommend that they apply here. PCAST found that they are not needed for small cell deployments. The unchallenged record evidence shows that they are unnecessary to protect federal incumbents. No one that I'm aware of believes that they make sense for the use cases we're considering. And, nonetheless, we once again propose to codify them. And going forward, the success of the 3.5 gigahertz band depends on shrinking the proposed exclusion zones. And I hope that interested parties take advantage of the Commission's characterization of this proposal as a starting point, and once again share their ideas and analysis on how to accomplish that goal. Now, beyond the exclusion zones, I have a few concerns regarding some other of today's proposals. For instance, I question the proposal to impose a hard 30 megahertz cap on the amount of priority access spectrum that any one entity can hold. Similarly, I question the item's proposal to carve out 20 megahertz of spectrum as a set-aside for certain groups of preferred users. I'm skeptical that these attempts to pick winners and losers will serve the public interest. But notwithstanding these concerns, I look forward to learning from the record that will be compiled as a result of today's item. I hope we improve our proposals so that the American consumers in the years to come will be able to benefit from the 3.5 gigahertz band. And in this regard, I take inspiration from another of Yogi Berra's wise aphorisms: it ain't over till it's over. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we take another step towards allocating the 3.5 gigahertz band for additional wireless uses. In the future, this band could be opened up for use by small cell systems, wireless backhaul, or the next innovative wireless technology. But we are faced with balancing the introduction of new wireless service with the challenging task of protecting incumbents from harmful interference. That is why I strongly prefer clearing federal government users and reallocating oversharing. In this unique case, however, it may be worthwhile to pursue sharing to move forward quickly instead of waiting for better solution or for clearing to be completed. To this end, the 3.5 gigahertz band will be one big experiment in terms of the proposed sharing design and the licensing scheme. I will vote in favor of today's further notice, but I have several concerns that I would like to see addressed before any final rulemaking. First, like my fellow commissioners, especially my friend from Kansas, I worry that the proposed exclusion zones that cover 60% of the U.S. population are too large to attract adequate investment and interest in this band. The 3.5 band would be largely unusable on the east and west coast and along the Gulf. As you can see from this slide, New England, Florida, Louisiana, and almost all of New York, Virginia, California, it looks like as well, Texas, and even South Carolina are in exclusion zones. I hope and trust that they can be substantially reduced and that there will be opportunities for the new wireless operators and federal incumbents to coordinate in these areas. Second, I am concerned that the proposed term, and geographic size of the priority access licenses, or PALs, may also hinder investment and innovation. For example, PALs may be licensed for 1-year terms that may be aggregated up to 5 years. There is no certainty that, after making capital expenditures during that time, a licensee will be able to continue its priority access. Third, this further notice supports a three-tiered use system, as my colleagues have indicated, that includes incumbents, PALs, and general authorized access users. If this is not complicated enough, the Commission proposes to reserve up to 20 megahertz of spectrum for critical users within indoor facilities that may expand preferential treatment to certain outdoor facilities. And although we have not fully defined this class of users at this stage, it does not appear that many hospitals, public safety entities, or local governments are actively seeking the spectrum. Why not eliminate contained access user set-asides and allow GAA or PAL providers to offer services to these users? Further, this item proposes spectrum aggregation limits for PALs in the 3.5 gigahertz band, which I believe to be completely unnecessary. Given the propagation characteristics of the spectrum and its ease for reuse, there will be plenty of opportunity for operators to deploy any number of devices and services in the spectrum. Finally, the 3.5 gigahertz band is an ideal placement of small cells, which are helping carriers manage network congestion as data increases exponentially every year. Therefore, we should work to finalize the proceeding to implement Section 6409 of the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act, or separate off for its own proceeding consideration of just small cells, whichever can be done faster. If we want the 3.5 gigahertz experiment to work, we need to move forward on small cell siting. I thank the dedicated staff from the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, the Office of Engineering and Technology, and the International Bureau for all of their hard works today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Commissioner O'Reilly. I'll try to be brief again. Obviously, this further notice is teeing up ideas that are essential to our spectrum future. And it's not just the innovation that we're encouraging, but as Commissioner Clyburn said, the marriage of innovation and regulation. And as Commissioner Rosenworcel has said, it has the potential to give us a blueprint for where we can go in the future with spectrum. Clearly key to that is the concept of spectrum sharing. We're moving away from analog ideas that have existed since the time of Marconi. And we're harnessing the resiliency of digital signals and the use of databases to make real-time assignment a reality so that you can have a shared and prioritized use of the same spectrum. Now, that kind of rolls off the tongue as something that's simple to describe, but it's incredibly difficult to implement. I've previously expressed in meetings like this the need for incumbent spectrum users, especially federal agencies, to be innovative rather than insular on this topic of spectrum sharing. We will continue to work with them, to push them, so that together we can innovate for the benefit of all. I join my colleagues in saluting the team that put this together, including John Leibovitz's seemingly unending alphabet list. So thank you to all of you, and we'll now call for a vote. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Ayes have it. The request for editorial privileges is granted. Madam Secretary, would you please announce the items on today's consent agenda?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As mentioned at the beginning of the meeting today, you will consider a consent agenda composed of the items listed under the consent agenda portion of the Commission sunshine notice. Again, noting that items 3 and 4 were adopted by the Commission and have been deleted from the agenda. For your convenience during this vote, I have provided each of you with a copy of the sunshine notice and the consent agenda.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. So we have previously sought the consent of all commissioners for the inclusion of these items on a consent agenda. We have removed from the proposed agenda, a consent agenda, any item on which we received an objection from any commissioner. And for the consent items listed on the sunshine notice, we've received no objections from any commissioner. Accordingly, I will shortly call the vote on this consent agenda. If you are voting to adopt all of the consent items, please indicate it by voting in favor. If you oppose the adoption of any of the items on the consent agenda, please vote oppose, and I'll call on you in turn to identify the item that you are opposing by the number assigned to it on the sunshine notice. With that, all in favor of adopting the items listed on the consent agenda, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. So ordered. Are there any announcements my colleagues would like to make? Commissioner Clyburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to take this time to recognize two interns who have been integral members of my team. Pauline Lee, a second-year law student at American University, has provided outstanding research support on a wide range of issues over the last few months. In addition to her legal and research skills, Pauline brought a quiet energy to our staff. No one would believe quiet in my staff. Well, anyway, we'll talk about that. In addition to a can-do attitude. This is Pauline's last day on the job, so I wanted to publicly acknowledge her and thank her for her contributions to my office. Pauline, if you would stand to be recognized. Thank you. Stephanie Frank, a third-year law student at Charlotte Law School, became an integral part of our staff from day one. As a full-time law clerk, Stephanie rolled up her sleeves and dove into some of the most difficult items on our agenda, providing excellent research, editing, and background support for me and my staff. She has been a cheerful, competent, and dedicated member of our team and has made many friends at the Commission during her short stay. All of this has been done by simultaneously serving as the editor of her law review. Impressive indeed. This is Stephanie's last open meeting, and I wanted to acknowledge and commend her good work. Stephanie will be graduating in a few weeks and preparing for the Virginia Bar exam. The best to both of these incredibly talented women who have made tremendous contributions to my office and to this agency. Their future is, of course, very bright, and I wish them all the best. And keep in touch if we haven't driven you too crazy. Good to see you. And again, if you would acknowledge their presence. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I want to acknowledge that today, April 24th, is International Girls in ICT Day. This day was designated by the International Telecommunications Union. But closer to home on these shores, women hold half the jobs in this economy, but only 1/4 of the jobs in science, technology, engineering, and math. And yet STEM fields are growing 3 times faster than all other job fields in the entire economy. So closing that gap is important as a matter of equity. Closing that gap is important as a matter of creating more economic opportunity. And for me, that's not just professional, it's personal, because I am the mother of a little girl and a little boy. And like every parent, you look at them and you think about the future. And I think when it comes to the future of STEM and diversity, we have some work to do. So I am pleased that the International Bureau will be celebrating this day today and look forward to taking part in that.
A couple things, Mr. Chairman. First and foremost, this is the first meeting we have had since your most recent birthday. I want to wish you a belated happy birthday. You only turned 29 once, and I hope you made it memorable.
Very much.
Secondly, like my colleague, I want to mention International Girls in ICT Day, which I believe is tomorrow, April 24th. But yeah.
I don't know what day it is.
Well, yeah. We all track of time. But I had a chance, thanks to the team at the International Bureau, to meet with a group of girls from North Africa and the Middle East last year for International Girls in ICT Day. And it was honestly quite moving to see how these young girls who come from societies that don't necessarily encourage girls and women to enter into STEM fields, how the dreams they had for the future. And so I think that this day, which is being celebrated in 41 countries tomorrow, is a good way to change the conversation about ICT, about STEM, and frankly about the status of women worldwide. like my colleague, Commissioner Rosenworcel, I'm the father of a little girl. I'm also the son of a woman who made STEM her life, and so I take it personally as well that we need to encourage greater gender and other diversity in this field. So thank you to the ITU for setting up this event, and I look forward to commemorating it again tomorrow.
Commissioner O'Reilly.
No announcements.
I want to, again, try to be brief, identify with what my colleagues have said about the celebration tomorrow and the focus tomorrow and the importance of that. And also, this was the second time that we moved a consent agenda, and I say thank you to my colleagues. There were 10 items that started out on this agenda that we were able to get through many of them before even reaching this point. You all have travel schedules. You all have a lot of other things that you're working on, and the fact that you have been able to move these is great for the efficiency and effectiveness of this commission, and I'm grateful to all of you. We will continue to use the consent agenda. It was a component of the reform process that we started, and I'm glad to see that it's working in it. And if nobody has anything further, we will declare this meeting adjourned and look forward to the next meeting on May 15th. This meeting's adjourned. Hello, everybody. Happy Shakespeare's 450th birthday today for all of you literary mavens. I know you're all. Look at Howard Norton. If Garrison Keillor says it's so.
The birthday that Commissioner Pai recognized? Oh, no, that was the 29th.
No, he only feels like he's 450 years old, the one he recognized. So in honor of Shakespeare's birthday, I'm going to read some less than Shakespearean prose. So today, ensuring universal access to modern communications and promoting the efficient use of spectrum are two of the long-standing goals that we've had here at the FCC. And in today's meeting, we approved new approaches to advance each of those core missions. Starting with spectrum, I believe that spectrum sharing has the potential to be a revolutionary new way to derive greater value from finite spectrum resources. And today's item proposing to make the 3.5 band a test bed for spectrum sharing innovation is one of the most significant actions yet to move spectrum sharing from concept to reality. On universal access, the Connect America Fund is the largest broadband infrastructure program ever established and one of the most important tools at our disposal to ensure that consumers and businesses in rural America have the same opportunities as their urban and suburban cousins. In phase one of CAF, we were able to deploy broadband to over 1,600,000 Americans who never had it before. Today we move towards phase two, which will support faster connections in rural America and improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the program. Both items are significant. Collectively, they advance new strategies to connect U.S. consumers to world-leading wired and wireless broadband networks. And thanks to the commissioners and the staff and all the stakeholders as well who made this possible. I'll be happy to answer any questions. Do you think that since Brooks moved down to this end to try and game the system that we should start with?
Yeah, but then doesn't that punish me?
Huh?
Why don't you start with me, go all the way down, and then have Brooks?
You know, I mean, it's just...
You can randomly choose. You can start in the middle. Go
Yes, Brooks.
AT&T has made threats to sit out the incentive auction. Does that doom the auction if they sit out?
Oh, golly, Brooks. I mean, I think that anybody who has advocated so hard for additional spectrum that it would be hard to conceive of them not participating in the opportunity to get the spectrum. They've made a really good case as to why there's a need for more spectrum, and I think they were speaking factually.
A couple of the commissioners in the 3.5 gigahertz item talked about the set aside, or rather the cap, if you will, of 30 megahertz of any amount of that spectrum. I wanted to see if you wanted to respond to their criticism of that proposal in the 3.5 gigahertz item.
Well, I think it's important that what we're doing is we're asking questions. So there'll be a full record that'll get developed on that, and that's how we'll be answering that.
Kate Tamarella from The Hill.
Hi, Kate.
I was wondering if I could get your thoughts on the Aereo case and any implications it will have for the incentive auction next year.
You know, Aereo is not something that we concern ourselves with. I read about it in the newspaper and whatever you all write, so I'm as anxious to wait for, what is it? I guess the end of June, is that when they're saying the decision comes out, something like that?
Howard Buskirk. I wanted to ask a 3.5 gigahertz question. There was a lot of discussion from the other commissioners about the exclusion zones, and from what I understand, the decision was made to sort of go with the exclusion zones that had been adopted or had been proposed a couple years earlier, and that hadn't been a very well developed part of the NPRM. In retrospect, does that seem like a big issue to you, and is that something that maybe there should have been maybe a little more attention paid to as this NPRM was under development?
I disagree, first of all, that it wasn't a very well considered part of the NPRM. How in the world could you ever get that impression? But let me talk about what's going on here. I mean, this is spectrum sharing. Okay. Sharing is challenging. Now, we had two options. We could sit here and say, well, now let's just wait, let's see, and maybe we'll be able to work things out, and gee, people can talk. Or we could say, hey, look, we're moving. It's time to step up. Let's get this resolved. I said in my remarks that we would continue to work with, and I believe I used the word push, our federal partners, and I am and we are. But this is a process of let's move this along. Let's not just sit here and wait for something to occur, because things don't happen without impetus. We created the impetus.
Jeff Bliss from MLEX. Sinclair Broadcast Group sent in a letter critical of the repacking provision of the auction setup, and I wanted to give you a chance to respond to it. They're worried it's going to be too expensive, there aren't enough details for them to plan, so on and so forth.
No, we had a meeting with broadcasters yesterday in a group. Repacking is clearly one of the issues that they're sensitive to, and we are sensitive to it as well, and we're going to address their issues.
Bryce Bashik, two-part question about Comcast Time Warner Cable. I'm wondering what your initial reaction are to the public interest benefits of the deal, and will you pursue merger conditions that could serve as de facto rules for the rest of the marketplace?
Two-part response. I'm not going to respond to Comcast merger questions. Second part, I'm not going to further respond to Comcast merger questions.
Hi, Mr. Chairman. David Hatch, Policy and Regulatory Report.
Hey, David.
Is the FCC working on some sort of a compromise designed to compel AT&T to participate in the spectrum auction?
Nobody is compelling anybody to participate in the spectrum auction. Whether the broadcasters sell or the wireless carriers buy is entirely a function of their own free will in the marketplace that we create. Like I said to Brooks's question, I find it hard to believe that somebody who has advocated so forcefully about why it is absolutely essential that they have spectrum like this would pass on the opportunity.
Hi, Chairman.
Hey, Brendan.
Brendan Sasso with National Journal. I'll follow in Bryce's footsteps with a two-part question about the spectrum rules, though. And so you said earlier that it's hard to conceive of AT&T not participating. So I'm wondering, do you not take their threat seriously? And then the second part is, would the rules be subject to change? Say, hypothetically, Sprint tries to buy T-Mobile. Would that be a reason to go back and revisit the rules?
Well, you know what the answer to the second one is, and we'll try to avoid hypotheticals. Okay.
I mean, a variety of hypotheticals. Would the rules be subject to change?
Insofar as the first part of your question. Again, the wireless carriers, including AT&T, have been very forceful and persuasive in making the case that the success of their ability to serve consumers, and therefore the success of their business, depends on additional spectrum. I have a hard time envisioning this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for this kind of beachfront spectrum being something that people throw up their hands and walk away from.
Alina.
Hi, Alina Selyuk, Reuters. There's been research showing that in the long run, either Sprint or T-Mobile is bound to fail unless they somehow support each other. I am wondering if you're concerned about that kind of outcome being inevitable.
We are for a competitive marketplace. One of the interesting things that I've learned in various sides of this dais is that there is always research that says, well, here's this, or this could happen. We're interested in making sure that competition is the watchword in the industries over which we have responsibility. And we'll focus on that like a laser.
Matthew Schwartz, Communications Daily. A specific question for you. There have been reports that you're considering adding something on net neutrality to the agenda for the May 15th meeting. I
read it in Communications Daily, so it must be true.
It wasn't me. I'm quoting a different reporter. Could you confirm whether there may be...
So what do you guys do, tag team? How does this work? Huh?
Question I wanted to ask about exclusion zones.
Chairman Wheeler, could you confirm whether you may be circulating a further
Yes,
notice
I can.
Tomorrow for the meeting?
Yes.
On net neutrality?
Yes.
Thank you.
Gotham.
Now I have all sorts of questions. But I'll go with the most basic. Chairman Wheeler, is the wireless market currently competitive in your view?
So I think that is always a question that is in flux, and always a question that you want to be asking and interpreting. What we are trying to do is to make sure that there is sufficient spectrum, and so that there can be sufficient competition. This is a dynamic process. Things change over time, and we believe that what is extant in the market today in terms of 4 major competitors is an important and driving force in the competitive nature of that market. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
If there are questions for the bureaus, we'll start that now. First with the Wireline Bureau and Wireless Bureau on Connect America. Any questions on the Connect America fund item?
What? Let's throw them off by asking.
Okay, Matt.
Hi, I just have kind of a logistical question. There's so many different parts to this this kind of rulemaking. Can you tell me what is in one order and what's in the seventh order, and just there's a few different orders. If you could just clarify that.
The report and order adopts rules for the competitive bidding process, and it adopts rules for the transition in Phase 2 support, and it codifies a rule that was previously adopted by the Commission. So that's the report and order. The declaratory ruling addresses what is a reasonable request for service, for broadband service for rate of return carriers. The order portion of the item addresses the rate floor issue that was spoken about at some length.
And that's different from the report and order?
Correct.
So that's the seventh order?
No, there's something called an order.
Okay, thank you.
And it is delaying the implementation of a rule. So it is in the order.
Okay.
Not the report and order.
That delays the implementation of the rate floor increase?
Correct. The rate floor support reductions will not occur under the rule until January 2nd, 2015, and then on January 2nd, 2015, reductions will only occur for rates that are below $16. And then the order concludes that approach will be maintained in place until July 1st, 2016, at which point, commencing July 1st, 2016, there would be support reductions only for rates that are below $18. Got that?
Yes.
Okay. Do you want to hear about the rest? So the
And then,
seventh
I'm sorry,
order on
the final phasing on the phase-in of the rate floor. So then there would only be one more step in that, which would be
basically it's $2. It goes from 14 to 16. Like right now, it's 14.
Okay.
And it will go to 16 on July 1st, 2015. It will go to 18 on July 1st. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Let's
January
start
2nd, 2015?
January 2nd, 2015, it will go to $16. July 1st, 2016, it will go to $18. And then it will raise no more than $2 annually thereafter. So July 1st, 2017, it would go to $20.
Okay, thank you. And then the seventh?
Or whatever the rate survey shows.
And then there's the seventh order?
The seventh order on reconsideration eliminates the QRA benchmarking rule and provides relief on the safety net additive rule. And then the rest is all in the further notice.
Okay, and then just one final question. The 10-year term of support for Phase 2, is that a change from 5 years originally contemplated?
No, the Commission had not decided. In the transformation order, the Commission had not decided what the term of support would be for competitive bidding winners. It sought comment on the further notice in the transformation further notice back in 2011. So the order is now going to order on that question.
So the 5 years I'm thinking was in the further notice earlier?
No, let's start over. The Commission in 2011 adopted a 5-year term for price cap carriers that accept the offer of model-based support. In 2011, it sought comment on what the appropriate term of support should be for winning bidders in the competitive process in those states where the price cap carrier turns down support.
Any other connected questions? Okay, thank you. And now for the 3.5 gigahertz, 3.5 gigahertz item.
No, you're very helpful. Sorry that I messed it up a little bit.
Howard or Paul?
Well, I think the obvious question for John is, what do you think about AT&T's threat? No, just kidding. There was a lot of discussion about exclusion zones, and I was wondering if there's any more clarification since we don't have the item yet. I mean, when you all adopted the NPRM, there was discussion about the 60% of the U.S.
Right.
Is there any more clarification you can give us on the proposals in this item?
Yeah, so obviously, I think throughout the entire proceeding, going back to 2012 and even before that, the previous chairman and the staff, we've been very conscious of the exclusion zones and the potential for small cells to reduce the exclusion zones. I think that's very much something that we were contemplating as a possibility prior to report and order. I think the key things that people need to understand, I think, are number one, especially from the federal side, the systems that are in these bands are incredibly important to national security, so we have to get the analysis right. Number two, that although there have been very helpful technical submissions in the record to date about the exclusion zones, they have, for the most part, been one-sided submissions, sort of outside-in analysis from industry. One of the most interesting and I think promising developments in this proceeding is that there are a number of ongoing studies that represent partnerships between industry, including companies like Qualcomm, academia, and the federal agencies, so NTIA, and they have a lab in Boulder, that look at the two-way interactions between the LTE technology and the federal radars in much more and provide an empirical view of what the interference effects are. We expect some of those results will be published soon, and we, of course, will be hoping to bring that into the record in the proceeding. And we are working with our federal partners, and I think everyone is expecting that based on the results of these new studies, that will provide a new opportunity to take a look at the exclusion zones with fresh data in a way that provides a fact-based approach to revisiting them, essentially.
Just one follow-up. There was mention of 20 megahertz carve-out, but then one of the commissioners said it doesn't really specifically say or propose who that should be to. They mentioned hospitals and I believe local governments. Can you just clarify what that proposal is?
Yeah, there's a proposal for something called a contained access facility. You can think of this as, the original NPRM, the entire party access tier was oriented around protecting certain kinds of critical infrastructure services and providers. This is a sort of much reduced version of that proposal, and essentially the basic idea is just that it's actually a portion of the GAA pool, and the idea is that there are certain places where there are contained facilities where the general public doesn't have access to those facilities anyway, yet those facilities may have certain needs for greater protection. So the idea is, the proposal is to give them the ability to have slightly greater protection inside the confines of those facilities for 20 megahertz of spectrum.
And congratulations. I wanted to ask, am I correct in what I think I've heard from various places that the exclusion zone proposal that is contained in this further NPRM is largely the same as the one that was?
Yeah, I just want to clarify that the key. Okay, so I think the headline, in my opinion, on this proposal is that it's a very detailed set of rules to implement the entire set, all the concepts that we've been talking about throughout the pendency of this rulemaking. There's 20 pages of rule text, very detailed. It proposes a new rule part 96, and it goes into a very high level of detail to propose specific rules to implement this new service. We did not want to leave any aspect of the proposal sort of empty. So in this case, we used as the starting point the fast track proposal based on the 2010 NTIA report. But as I said before, there's new data that we expect to be coming in soon. There have been a lot of discussions with industry, academia, and NTIA, and I would expect this is something that we'll see collaboration on before we go to report and order to revisit the exclusion zones.
And then one final question. It seemed like the reason that this has become such a big issue is I think there's a concern that if the exclusion zones are too big, this spectrum, the whole band's much less viable. I mean, is that basically a correct?
I think that the staff, the previous chairman, the current chairman, have all share the view that we would like to make as much spectrum available for commercial use as possible, while protecting the important federal missions that are in the band. And the question is, based on empirical evidence, real studies, and ongoing discussions about the types of systems that will be in the band. And by the way, this proposal has a greater proposes more flexibility than just small cells, so there's other types of systems that might be in the band. What's the art of the possible in terms of sharing? And that's what we hope to be exploring the next few months before we go to report and order.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. Welcome